There's a particular kind of hunger that has no name in the languages of the comfortable. It lives in the body like a second skeleton pressing outward from beneath the skin, reminding you in quiet moments, in the middle of a meal that is never quite enough, in the pause before sleep that never comes easily, that you were born into a world that did not arrange itself with you in mind. It is not merely the hunger for food, though that is part of it. It is the hunger for legitimacy, for the feeling that your existence has been acknowledged by the great indifferent machinery of prosperity that hums along the highways and gleams from the windows of buildings you have never entered. This is the hunger that made Marcus Hale, and this is the hunger that unmade him. He was born in Decatur, Illinois, in the winter of 1987, the second son of a woman who cleaned other people's houses and a man who left before Marcus was old enough to remember the shape of his shadow on the wall. The apartment where he grew up was on the third floor of a building that smelled of mildew and the particular exhaustion of people who had long ago stopped expecting things to improve. His mother, Doreen, was a woman of extraordinary endurance. She ironed other people's shirts and wiped other people's counters and smiled at other people's children and came home each evening with hands so dry they cracked at the knuckles and bled in cold weather. She never complained about this. She complained about almost nothing, which Marcus understood only much later was not strength, but rather a grief so complete it had become indistinguishable from acceptance. He watched the world from that apartment window with an attention that bordered on ferocity. He watched the cars pass on the street below, and he cataloged them with the seriousness of a scholar. The age of the vehicle, the condition of the paint, the posture of the driver. He understood, even as a child of 7 or 8, that there was information embedded in these objects, that the world was a text written in the language of ownership, and that he had been born illiterate in that language. He was determined to learn it. School did not teach him what he needed to know. School taught him fractions in the capitals of states he had no hope of visiting, and the names of battles fought by men whose descendants now lived in the houses his mother cleaned. He was not a poor student. He was something more dangerous than a poor student. He was a brilliant student in a system that did not know what to do with brilliance, that arrived without the proper documentation, without the right address, without the social architecture that converts raw intelligence into recognized achievement. His teachers liked him and forgot him in the same breath. He won a mathematics competition in 7th grade and received a certificate that his mother laminated and hung on the wall beside the window. And that certificate seemed to Marcus, in his darker moments, to be the most perfect symbol of his situation. An official acknowledgement of something exceptional, rendered in a format that conferred absolutely nothing. He graduated high school in 2005 and did not go to college, not because he lacked the mind for it, but because the logistics of it, the forms, the loans, the dormitory deposits, the 1,000 small financial gates that stand between intention and enrollment, defeated him before he could begin. He worked instead for a time at a distribution warehouse on the edge of town, sorting packages in the cold for wages that arrived on Fridays like an insult delivered with a handshake. He worked at a car wash. He worked at a call center, selling insurance to people who couldn't afford it, over a telephone that grew warm against his ear over the course of an 8-hour shift. It was at the call center that something began to shift inside him. He was good on the telephone. He had a voice that inspired trust, a measured, warm baritone that seemed to come from somewhere more solid and reliable than his actual circumstances. He could feel it working on the people at the other end of the line, feel the slight relaxation in their voices when he spoke, feel the moment when skepticism became something softer. He was not manipulating them, or at least he did not think of it that way. He was simply communicating. He was simply translating something, his own urgent need to succeed, into a language they could receive. But he noticed the power of it. He noticed that the voice was a kind of currency he had been given without anyone's permission, without anyone's investment, and that it could be spent in ways that other forms of currency could not. He left the call center in the summer of 2007, just as the first tremors of the great financial earthquake were beginning to move through the foundations of the American economy. He moved to Chicago with $300 and a phone number written on a cocktail napkin, the number of a man named Darius Webb, who had once given a speech at a community center in Decatur about financial freedom and building wealth on your own terms. Marcus had been skeptical at the time, but the words had stayed with him, turning over and over in his mind like stones in a river, smoothing themselves into something he could hold. Darius Webb was not what Marcus had imagined. He was a compact electric man in his mid-40s who lived in an apartment in Wicker Park that was furnished almost entirely in white, and who spoke about money the way some people speak about God, with a combination of reverence and intimacy that suggested a personal relationship, a private communion. He was involved in network marketing, which was the phrase he used, always, with great care, because the phrase he was not using was the phrase that hovered invisibly at the edge of every conversation he had about his business. Marcus understood this even then. He understood it and did not care, because what Darius was selling was not a product or a plan or even a scheme. What Darius was selling was the feeling of being on the inside of something, the feeling of being invited. For a young man who had spent his entire life with his face pressed against the glass of other people's prosperity, that feeling was very nearly intoxicating. The product was a line of nutritional supplements, capsules and powders with names drawn from the vocabulary of ancient civilizations and natural philosophy, promising clarity and energy, and the vague but potent suggestion of transformation. They were not entirely without merit. Some people felt better taking them, some people felt nothing. A few people, as is always the case with supplements and faith and placebos and hope, felt considerably worse. But the product, Marcus quickly understood, was secondary. The product was a necessary fiction, a legal and physical artifact around which the actual business, the business of recruiting, could be organized. He threw himself into it with a completeness that frightened even him in retrospect. He worked 18 hours a day, making calls, attending meetings, driving to suburban living rooms where he stood before small audiences of people who were themselves hungry in the way he recognized, who had come because they had seen a flyer at a laundromat, or received a text from a cousin, or simply because the particular shape of their desperation had led them to a Tuesday evening in someone else's home, listening to a young man from Decatur tell them that the life they wanted was not only possible, but close, just there, just on the other side of a decision they could make tonight. He was, by any objective measure, extraordinary at this. He had the voice, and he had something beyond the voice, a quality of conviction that was not entirely performed. He believed in those early months in the architecture of what he was building. He believed in it the way young architects believe in their drawings, before they understand the properties of material, before they have watched a structure they designed begin to fail. The belief was real. It was only the object of the belief that was questionable. By 2009, Marcus Hale had built a network of nearly 400 people across Illinois, Indiana, and the outer edges of Wisconsin. He had a second-floor office above a printing shop in the Logan Square neighborhood. He had an assistant named Veronica who answered his phone with a professionalism that suggested an organization considerably larger than the one that actually existed. He had a car, a black Audi that he leased at a monthly payment that consumed an alarming percentage of his income, and he drove it to his appointments with the specific consciousness of a man who knows that the vehicle he arrives in will be noticed and interpreted before he opens his mouth. He had also, by this point, begun to restructure the business in ways that departed from the model Darius Webb had introduced him to. He had begun to design something of his own. He called it Apex Ascent. The name came to him in the middle of the night, in the particular clarity that sometimes arrives between 3 and 4 in the morning, when the mind is tired enough to stop censoring itself and simply reaches for what it actually wants. Apex Ascent. The geometry of it pleased him, the implication of a peak, of achievement, of elevation, but also the continuous nature of the word ascent, which was not arrival but movement, which demanded not a destination but a direction, which could therefore never be fully evaluated because it was always in process, always becoming. The structure he designed was elegant in the way that certain traps are elegant, with a cleanness of purpose, an economy of parts, a logic that was internally consistent even as it was externally destructive. New members joined by purchasing an enrollment package, originally priced at $499, which gave them access to the supplements, to the marketing materials, and to the income opportunity. The income opportunity meant that for every person they recruited who also purchased an enrollment package, they received a commission. And for every person that recruit brought in, they received a smaller commission, and so on, down through levels that were given names: associate, builder, director, summit, peak, which conferred both status and the arithmetic justification for everything that had come before. The people at the top earned money from the activity of an ever-expanding base of people below them. The people at the bottom needed the base to grow infinitely in order to recoup their investment. The base, of course, could not grow infinitely. The base was, in the end, the world. And the world is finite, and the people on the bottom of a geometric progression always pay for the mathematics of those above them. But Marcus did not think in these terms, or rather, and this is the more accurate and more damning truth, he thought in these terms only briefly and only late at night, in the same nocturnal clarity that had given him the name Apex Ascent. And then the morning came, and the day resumed, and there were phone calls to make, and meetings to run, and commissions to deposit, and the narrative he told himself about what he was doing was so much more vivid and immediate than the abstract structure of what he was doing that the narrative won, as it almost always does. The years between 2009 and 2013 were years of extraordinary expansion and extraordinary self-deception in roughly equal measure. Apex Ascent grew. It grew in the way of things that offer people something they urgently need, not supplements, never supplements, but the feeling of agency, the feeling that the architecture of their financial lives was something they could design, rather than something that was simply imposed upon them by forces too large and too indifferent to negotiate with. Marcus hired staff. He rented a proper office in a high-rise building in the Loop, which gave the enterprise a legitimacy that was architectural before it was financial. He developed a presentation, a 90-minute performance that he delivered at hotel conference rooms across the Midwest. That was among the most finely calibrated pieces of persuasion most of his audiences had ever encountered. He spoke about his mother's hands. He spoke about the apartment in Decatur and the cracked knuckles and the laminated certificate on the wall. He spoke about these things not as wounds, but as evidence. Evidence that the system he was now offering an alternative to was real. That his understanding of what it meant to be excluded from prosperity was personal and not theoretical. That he was not speaking to them from the outside of their experience, but from the deepest inside of it. And this, more than anything else, was what made him effective. Because it was true. The story of Doreen Hale's hands was true. The apartment was real. The certificate was real. And so the authority he claimed on the basis of these things was genuinely earned, even if the thing he was using that authority to sell was not what he claimed it to be. He met a woman named Patricia during this period, a school teacher from Evanston who had come to one of his presentations at the invitation of her brother, who was already a director-level member of Apex Ascent. Patricia was skeptical of the presentation in a way that most of his audiences were not, which meant she asked questions that most of his audiences did not, which meant that Marcus had to work harder in the conversation that followed than he typically worked. And that working harder made him feel something he had not expected to feel, a kind of respect that was almost gratitude. They were together for nearly 2 years. She never joined Apex Ascent. She watched it from the outside with an expression that Marcus understood, but could not, would not, allow himself to take seriously. When she left him, in the autumn of 2012, she said something that he would repeat to himself, in various forms, for years afterward. She said that he was the most gifted person she had ever met, and that she was afraid of what he was going to do with that gift. He did not understand, then, that this was not a compliment. By 2013, Apex Ascent had approximately 12,000 members across 17 states. It had grossed in total enrollment fees and product sales somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million. Marcus Hale was 25 years old. He lived in a condominium in River North with views of the Chicago River and Lake Michigan, depending on which window you stood at. He owned, at last, rather than leased, his car. He wore suits that cost more than his mother had earned in a month of cleaning other people's homes, and he wore them with a comfort that was both genuine and slightly theatrical, because the suits were not only clothing, but argument. They were the daily renewal of his claim to belong in a world that had once not known he existed. He was also, though he did not fully admit this to himself, frightened. The geometry of the thing he had built had begun to press against the edges of sustainability in ways that he could feel rather than quantify. The rate of new recruitment was slowing. The people at the bottom of the structure were beginning to surface. At his presentations, in his email inbox, in the comment sections of the message boards that discussed Apex Ascent with increasing specificity, with the particular quality of confusion that precedes anger, the quality of people who have run the mathematics and found that the mathematics do not resolve the way they were promised. His directors were calling him with questions he answered smoothly and completely, and that he knew, as he answered them, were questions that did not have smooth and complete answers. He hired a compliance attorney in 2013, a thin, meticulous man named Gerald Foss, who had spent 20 years working for the Federal Trade Commission before entering private practice. Gerald told Marcus, in a meeting that lasted 3 hours, and that Marcus left feeling he had been slowly and carefully turned inside out, that the structure of Apex Ascent was, in his professional opinion, not defensible. He used words that were precise and terrible in their precision. He used the word unsustainable. He said the phrase income claims. He said the phrase primary income source in the context of a statute that Marcus had not previously been aware of and wished, sitting in that office, that he remained unaware of. He did not say pyramid scheme, because Gerald Foss was too careful and too professional to use a phrase that he knew would cause his client to stop listening. But the shape of what he described was unmistakable. Marcus retained Gerald and then did not take Gerald's advice. This is perhaps the defining act of the story, the hinge on which everything turns. He knew after that meeting what he had built. He knew it with the same certainty with which he had always known, at some level, that the numbers did not resolve the way he told people they would resolve. He knew it with the knowledge that lives in the body, that shows itself in the quality of sleep and the tension in the jaw and the slight delay barely perceptible before certain sentences complete themselves. He knew it, and he continued. He continued because the alternative, stopping, dismantling, acknowledging, felt from the inside of where he stood like a destruction so complete it would leave nothing. He had built this. He had built it from $300 and a phone number on a cocktail napkin, and the specific, ferocious will of a boy from Decatur who had spent his childhood watching cars from a third-floor window. To stop building was, in some sense, he could not entirely separate from the business itself. To stop existing in the way he had invented himself to exist. The investigation began in the spring of 2014. It began not with a dramatic raid or a sudden revelation, but in the quiet, bureaucratic way that federal investigations almost always begin, with paperwork, with subpoenas that arrived in manila envelopes and were signed for by Veronica and placed on his desk with a careful neutrality of expression that told him she had been expecting them longer than he had. The Illinois Attorney General's office was involved, and then the Federal Trade Commission, and then, because money had moved across state lines in quantities sufficient to attract their interest, the FBI. Marcus did not run. This is worth noting because the temptation to run, to move money, to disappear, to construct an escape from the geography of accountability, must have been present, must have been offered by some part of his imagination in the small hours of those early investigation months. He did not run because, it seems, he had convinced himself so thoroughly that what he had built was legitimate that the investigation itself felt to him like an injustice, like a misunderstanding that could be corrected with sufficient clarity of explanation. He hired lawyers. He submitted documents. He gave statements. He continued, for a period of months, to believe that his narrative of himself was more durable than the government's narrative of his numbers. It was not. The numbers do not care about narratives. The numbers, the enrollment figures, the commission structures, the percentage of members who had ever recovered their initial investment, the percentage who had made anything at all, the percentage who had lost money, which was the large percentage, which was the percentage that mattered. The numbers told a story of their own, in their own language, which was not the warm baritone language of a Tuesday evening in a suburban living room, but the cold, precise language of federal statute and actuarial reality. There were victims, the word that the legal documents would use, the word that Marcus would struggle with for the rest of his life. Not because it was inaccurate, but because it was so accurate as to be unbearable. There were 12,000 of them, approximately, distributed across 17 states, ranging from people who had lost several $100s to people who had lost their savings, their cars, their confidence in their own judgment, their willingness to trust a stranger's voice on a telephone or a Tuesday evening. There were people who had recruited their own family members, who had brought their sisters and their cousins and their elderly neighbors into the structure, and who now bore the particular grief of having been both deceived and deceiver simultaneously. People who were victims and who had created victims, who would carry both of these identities for years, turning them over in their minds like something they could not put down and could not hold comfortably. Among the victims, this is the detail that appeared in the newspaper coverage and that Marcus would later say hit him with a specific and unbearable force, were a significant number of people who came from backgrounds very like his own, people from the kinds of neighborhoods and the kinds of circumstances that had produced his hunger, that had produced the very argument he used to sell them the thing that took from them what little they had managed to accumulate. He had stood before them and told them his mother's story and offered them implicitly the promise that what had happened to him could happen to them. And in a terrible sense it had. What had happened to him, the specific mechanism of deprivation wearing the costume of opportunity, had happened to them exactly. The charges were filed in January of 2015, mail fraud, wire fraud, operating a pyramid scheme in violation of federal law. Marcus Hale was 27 years old. He surrendered his passport and appeared in federal court in Chicago on a Thursday morning in weather so cold the air itself seemed to be withholding something. His mother was there. Doreen Hale sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse in a coat that was not quite warm enough for the day, with hands that were still dry and still cracked at the knuckles. And she watched her son stand before a federal judge and hear the charges against him read aloud with the expressionless attention of a woman who has learned, over the course of a life, to receive difficult information without allowing her face to process it in public. He pleaded guilty in September of 2015 after months of negotiation between his legal team and the federal prosecutors. The plea agreement was a document of considerable specificity. It described what he had built and what it had taken from people in language that was deliberately stripped of the poetry he had used to construct those things. It was, in this sense, its own kind of mercy, a translation of his life's central work into a register that was honest about what it actually was. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $11 million, which was a figure derived from the amount of money that had entered the system and not returned to the people who had put it there. He served 4 years and 8 months at a federal correctional institution in Duluth, Minnesota. He was a model inmate, which is what the reports say about people who have a talent for presenting themselves in the terms most favorable to their current situation. And this description is true and also insufficient. He was also, by the accounts of the prison educators who worked with him, genuinely useful to other inmates. He taught a financial literacy course that the institution had instituted as part of its programming, and he taught it, apparently, with a care and a precision and a willingness to name the mechanisms of financial exploitation that suggested a man in genuine confrontation with what he had done. He was released in the spring of 2020 into a world that had been rearranged by a pandemic, which meant that the landscape of his re-entry was itself disoriented, itself in the process of confronting the distance between its assumptions about stability and the reality of how quickly things could change. He went back to Decatur. He went back to the apartment building, which was the same building and not the same building. Same mildew smell, same narrow staircase, different family in the apartment on the 3rd floor where he had watched cars from the window. His mother had moved, finally, to a smaller place 2 blocks away. He helped her move her things. He helped her carry boxes, and he noticed her hands, and she noticed him noticing, and neither of them said anything about it. He has not returned to any form of business since his release. He consults, occasionally and quietly, with organizations that work to educate people about predatory financial schemes, not as a reformed villain performing redemption for an audience, but in a more private and less dramatic capacity, reviewing materials, answering questions, providing from the inside of the experience a kind of knowledge that can be obtained in no other way. He lives in a modest apartment. He drives a modest car. Whether this modesty represents punishment or peace, or simply the arithmetic of restitution payments, it is impossible to say from the outside, and Marcus Hale does not say much about it from the inside. What remains when you try to hold all of this at once, the hunger, the gift, the structure, the victims, the plea, the years in Duluth, the return, is something that resists the simple resolution of either condemnation or sympathy. Both are present and both are insufficient. The boy who watched cars from the 3rd floor window was real. The ferocity of his desire to escape the world he was born into was real. The voice that made people feel, for an evening, that the architecture of their financial lives was something they could control. That voice was a genuine instrument, genuinely wielded. And the harm was real. The lost savings were real. The betrayed trust was real. The people who had brought their sisters and their cousins into a structure that would take from them. They are real and they are still out there. And some of them have recovered and some of them have not. And the ones who have not carry the weight of what happened in ways that are difficult to look at directly. There is something this country does to people who are born into scarcity and who possess extraordinary capability. It does not ignore them. It would be more honest if it ignored them. Instead, it shows them, continuously and from an early age, exactly what it is they cannot have and exactly how beautiful it would be to have it. It offers them the vocabulary of achievement without the grammar that makes the vocabulary functional. It celebrates the story of the self-made person with a fervor that borders on religious devotion. And it uses this story to explain away the people who are not self-made, to imply that the absence of wealth is a failure of will rather than a consequence of structure. And into this particular atmosphere, it releases people like Marcus Hale, people with the will and the intelligence and the hunger and the voice. And it watches what happens, and it is surprised by what happens, and it calls what happens by legal names and processes it through courts and sends it to correctional institutions and produces, in the end, the appearance of accountability, without anything resembling an honest accounting of the conditions that made the thing possible. This is not offered as excuse. There is no excuse that resolves the harm, and the harm does not wait for excuses. The 12,000 people who lost their money in Apex Ascent did not lose it to a system, or to an atmosphere, or to the historical conditions that produced Marcus Hale. They lost it to Marcus Hale. The responsibility is his, and he has acknowledged it, and he will spend a considerable portion of the rest of his life in the act of that acknowledgement, which is as it should be. But the story does not begin with Marcus Hale. It begins further back, in the arrangements that decided, before he was born, which children would look through windows and which children would be on the other side of the glass. It begins in the specific cruelty of a world that generates hunger deliberately and then punishes the hungry for the shapes their hunger takes. It begins in a winter in Decatur, Illinois, and it ends, if it ends, in a modest apartment and the turning over of stones in a river, smoothing themselves into something that can be held. Somewhere right now there is a child at a window. The cars pass below. The night is coming. The hunger has no name in the languages of the comfortable, but it is as old as the distance between what exists and what is possible, and it will not be still, and it will find a way. And the question that this story leaves behind, the question that does not resolve in courts or in plea agreements or in the clean language of federal statute, is what kind of way we want the hunger to find. We have not answered this question. We have not come close to answering it. We have only so far become very skilled at processing the consequences of our failure to answer it, and calling that skill justice and moving on.